On December 3rd, 2019, Sony officially announced that they had ended their run in the handheld games market. With the commercial failure of their sophomore handheld console, the PlayStation Vita, Sony officially turned away from handheld gaming and decided to fully turn their attention over to the real moneymaker, the PS4, and soon, the PS5. I myself have never owned a PS Vita, largely because I wasn't drawn in at all by the library on offer. And because of the fact that the higher storage memory cards cost more than the damn games, and that ain't right. Seriously, I don't want to fork over $300 American for the system, plus $25 or more for an SD card that only works with the Vita and nothing else. I'm really not in that big of a hurry to play Persona 4 Golden. So I've never owned or even played a Vita, but I will tell you what I do have. Sony's first real attempt at a handheld game device, the PlayStation Portable. PSP. The PSP was an interesting device. Released in Japan on December 12th, 2004, and in North America on March 24th, 2005, my 16th birthday no less, the PSP attempted to be a multimedia device, not just a gaming system. Sure, it played games, but it was also an MP3 player, and it even had big-budget movies released on special discs called UMDs, or Universal Media Discs. It was the first real handheld console to truly give Nintendo a run for their money, as it was a much beefier device than its competitor, the Nintendo DS, in terms of graphics, sound quality, and overall versatility. And the less said about the marketing on this thing, the better. PSP, 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 PSP. Much like with the Nintendo 3DS, shrunk-down handheld versions of multi-platform console games would also come to the PSP. But a few of those games, especially ones published by Sony, would eventually get ported to the PS2 or other systems, like the 2 Ratchet & Clank games, the 2 God of War games, and Jak and Daxter: The Lost Frontier. But not Daxter, though, the actually good one. I wonder why. That's not to say that the PSP didn't have some original games on it that you couldn't find on other systems, though, like the Death Jr. games, which I sadly haven't played. It also had Crisis Core, the first 2 Dissidia games, but there was one wholly original IP for the PSP that I did play that never got released on any other system. And it's one of the most unique, creepy, and downright hilarious games I've ever played. And that's 2007's Deadhead Fred, a title that had a lot going for it, and as I'll touch on in this video, a lot going against it. And now before we start, I want to mention that I initially hesitated to make this a franchise graveyard video, because while the game's developer, Vicious Cycle, is indeed dissolved, I wasn't able to find any intention from any of the developers for a desire to make a sequel aside from the game's lead voice actor. I decided to go ahead and make it a franchise graveyard video anyway, because part of my own criteria for it, that I don't think I ever disclosed, is my own personal desire to see a sequel or a continuation of any kind for the games that I cover here. Also, as was the case in my Bomberman Hero video, I will be playing this game on an emulator, but I do own a physical copy for it, and I was going to use that, but the component cables I bought for my PSP didn't work. Alright, enough preamble. It's time for me to pay my respects to Deadhead Fred today in the franchise graveyard. Developed for the PSP by North Carolina-based developer Vicious Cycle, the plans for Deadhead Fred's main gimmick, the head-swapping mechanic, actually began life as a game for the Nintendo GameCube targeted at younger gamers. It would have starred, this guy, a mass of geometric objects named Geo. He would have swapped geometric objects as heads to gain new properties and abilities. the cube head acting like a weight for certain pressure switch puzzles, a cone to allow him to spin like a top across narrow pathways, that kind of thing. Somewhere during early development, the team decided that the game, on the outside anyway, looked far too kiddie and uninteresting, but that the concept of changing heads for unique abilities still had a lot of potential. And with that awesome looking PSP on the horizon, it made sense for them to take the idea and maybe add it to a more mature game. Yeah, I'd say this is definitely more mature. Now let's start with that plot. Right at the title menu, you get this first-person view of the world floating in what appears to be some kind of green liquid or something. Starting a new game actually triggers the opening credits roll, which takes place in this same first-person view. It's a nice touch, and it really gives off the feeling of not knowing what the hell's going on when you first start the game. You're then greeted by Dr. Steiner, whose laboratory you're in. So, who are you? You're Private Detective Fred Newman. Fred was on the case of crime boss turned influential businessman Ulysses S. Pitt, who has opened a nuclear power plant in the fictional city of Hope Falls, New Jersey. Through the story, you come to find that Fred had evidence that could lead to the arrest of Ulysses Pitt and was murdered because of it. But Dr. Steiner, who worked for Pitt, recovered Fred's corpse and reanimated it. The only downside to this is, well,
I guess I do owe you one. Whatever they did to me, you put me back in one piece again.
Yes, well, mostly.
Mostly? What's that supposed to mean?
There's the small matter of your head.
My head? What about my head?
Perhaps you should take a look for yourself.
What the fuck? What have you done to me?
Yeah, Fred's missing his head. His memories are initially shot to hell due to the damage to his brain, but before he can get any answers, Pitt comes calling and captures Dr. Steiner. So if Fred wants any answers, he'll first need to rescue Dr. Steiner, and this is where the game begins properly. You actually rescue Dr. Steiner about an hour or so into the game, so there's a lot more that happens. Ulysses Pitt cut every corner imaginable when building his power plant, so the radiation resulted in some strange occurrences, such as the dead rising from their graves and hideous mutations on the residents of Hope Falls. But not everyone is out to kill you, as you'll find as soon as you step foot outside of Dr. Steiner's manor. One of the first ones you meet is Sam Spade, who runs the head shop. Yes, the demand for heads in Hope Falls is clearly so high that a whole market for it needed to be created. But this is where the aforementioned head-swapping mechanic comes into play. Like with what was initially planned with Geo, swapping heads will give Fred new abilities for combat, exploration, and puzzle solving. Fred's Jarhead has regenerating health and can go into stealth mode. Yes, it was the mid to late 2000s, there had to be stealth in there somewhere. The corpse head can store liquids with its stretchy cranium and spew them at will. Lighting yourself on fire while full of gasoline, for example, allows you to spray fire, and you can also float across large gaps with this head. The stone head will allow you to move heavy objects and walk underwater without drowning. And this isn't even all of the heads or all of their unique abilities. You gain these heads by performing a finishing move on enemies and decapitating them. Collect 5 of each type of new head, and you'll be asked to send them to Sam Spade. He'll keep 4 of them and modify the 5th for you to use. You can also upgrade these heads by finding gold worms. 1 gold worm will give one of your heads 1 upgrade. There are 14 in the game, and they can be found by either defeating bosses or completing side missions for NPCs. And there's a lot of side missions, though these usually involve trading items dropped by felled enemies for other items or even cash rewards. However, these trading missions are far from the only thing you can do in this game. Very early on, as early as the second main area, Creepy Hollow, you'll find a pool hall with a fully playable billiards table and pinball machine. You can bet money on it, or you can just play it for the heck of it. Yeah, the game really just lets you do that. It's standard issue billiards and pinball, but I couldn't help but spend more time on it than I probably should have. I just love pool that much. I would have liked a guideline of where the cue ball was going to go, and it can be a little slow, but still, it's fun. The minigames then go in a more twisted direction and give you a cockfighting minigame. You can raise and train mutant roosters to fight in cockfighting arenas for extra cash. There's even a fishing minigame if that's your thing. Neat. When you're not doing that, the game will mainly focus on you exploring areas, sometimes flipping switches, and other times platforming. A lot of times you'll be fighting enemies, but you'll mostly just be trying to get from point A to point B. Hope Falls is broken into several areas, and finding teleporters scattered around will allow you to fast travel between them. I'm sure by now you've no doubt noticed the game's presentation. It takes the 1940s American noir style and gives it a darker, more twisted bent. Vicious Cycle would coin the phrase twisted noir to describe the game's aesthetic. As far as visuals go, for a relatively early PSP game, it's got some of the sharpest graphics and art direction I've ever seen on the handheld. As a reminder, the footage you're seeing now is from an emulator, but I've got all the filters and upscalers turned off, and it's still a pretty good looking game. Not perfect, there's a lot of clipping and blocky textures here and there, but still, for a PSP game, it has some really good visual effects and excellent animations.
Most people would have taken a $15,000 ring straight to the pawn shop, but you brought it back to me.
Obviously, it's going to look much better on an actual PSP screen, which is another reason why I recommend hunting down a physical copy. And I'm happy to say that the strength of the presentation carries over into the sound department, too. The undeniable crown jewel in the sound department is the voice acting from our lead character, Fred. Fred is brilliantly voiced by John C. McGinley, whom you probably best know as the sarcastic asshole of a doctor, Dr. Cox, in the show Scrubs. And he brings all of that sarcastic energy to his performance as Fred, and cranks it up to 11 since they let him drop F-bombs here.
The name's Facia del Oso.
Boneface? Well, it fits, but I'd still have to kick my mother's ass for giving me a name like that if I were you. I'd track her down, and I'd beat the shit out of her.
The other performances, including that of the late John Pulido as main antagonist Ulysses Pitt, are all rock solid as well.
Which is why we dump the bodies there. But ain't no body that decomposes in a day, Doctor!
In fact, the writing in this game is so good, it actually won the Writers Guild of America's award for Best Writing for a Video Game in 2008, beating out Crash of the Titans. And rightfully so, because this game, despite its use of zombies, monsters, and gore, is funny as hell, and the writer should be commended for it. The dialogue alone easily makes this game worth playing.
Oh, normally, when I have a customer who's less than stunning, I recommend a face job. You need a head job.
Look, Elle, sweetheart, that's a super nice offer, it is. But we just met.
Oh, good lord. Is that all you men ever think about?
There are roughly a dozen areas that the game will have you explore during the main storyline, a couple of which actually take place within the city of Hope Falls instead of just outside it. One of my own personal favorite areas being Zombie Town, a derelict area that's become overrun with the undead. You're not here for very long if you're just doing the story mission, but Vicious Cycle went out of their way to create this one legitimately creepy house you can go into, and as a big fan of survival horror games, this was hitting all the right notes for me. Despite the game being more of a horror comedy, it's good to see that atmospheric horror be so strong here. Subjectively speaking, if the whole game were just exploration, platforming, and puzzle solving, I would have been just fine with it, as the game handles these elements quite well. Sadly, it's when the game throws enemy encounters at you where, what I consider, the only real sour note appears. A game like this, I find, would have sufficed well enough with a simple combat system akin to something like the first Jak and Daxter, but Deadhead Fred decided to go with a 3-hit combo-style combat system. Square for light attacks and X for heavy attacks when immediately followed by a light attack. Keep in mind the X button is also your jump button, so you can't lead a combo off with that. And you gotta switch between light and heavy to keep combos going and to keep enemies from blocking. And I don't know, it just feels kinda bare bones, I guess. Like, they wanted to have it be flashier, but they ran out of time. Honestly, I could actually believe that. In an interview with Gama Sutra, it was stated by Vicious Cycle devs that the lead designer for the game had left the company at this point, but was convinced to return to the company part-time to help out. As a result, for roughly 1/5 of the game's development, the dev team was flying without their lead designer. I can only imagine this affected the game's combat system, among other things like certain minigames getting the axe or story scenes being altered. The combat ain't the worst thing in the world when you're only fighting 1 or 2 enemies at a time, but later in the game is when you start getting challenged by 3 or even 4 at a time. Especially in the Tiki Head Club, where you have to fight the Tiki Head enemies that can teleport and create decoys that can shoot at you from a distance. Those sections are nothing short of aggravating, definitely my least favorite section in the game. It got to a point where if the game didn't explicitly tell me to fight and take out a certain number of enemies, I would just start running past them. I also can't help but wish that the PSP came with a second control slider for the camera controls. For a system that highlighted 3D games on par with the PS2, you'd think that would have been more of a priority. While you can just recenter the camera behind you by pressing down on the D-pad, the game strangely does also allow rotation by, and I'm not joking here, holding down the right trigger and moving the control slider. This is the only way to rotate the camera horizontally. And that's the only major complaint I have with the camera, because the field of vision the game gives you is definitely not bad. They did a good job of making sure a PSP game gives you a good view of your surroundings at any given time. It's just when you need to see what's below you, it can get kind of tricky. And this last bit I want to bring up, your mileage is definitely going to vary on this, as it depends on if you like cutscenes or not, but there are quite a few of them that interrupt gameplay. And many of them are quite lengthy as well. Definitely not as long as some of the cutscenes in games like Metal Gear Solid or Kingdom Hearts can get, but they can get pretty lengthy. Definitely make sure your PSP's battery is fully charged before you sit down to play this one. It's more than made up for by the fact that the cutscenes are incredibly well written and voice acted, though.
Yeah, well, I've got a gun leveled at your balls right now, so look. I don't want a hole in my door, and you don't want to leave singing soprano. So, if you want to leave with all the parts you came with, you'll do it now.
I kinda don't want to even show you too many of the cutscenes because the dialogue is just so good that I want you to experience it for yourself. If John C. McGinley wasn't already the star, he would have stolen the show. When it's all said and done, I can't help but be impressed that Vicious Cycle made such a robust game with the intention of it being a PSP exclusive. But that ambition ended up kneecapping the dev team. So much so that it ended up delaying the game from a first quarter 2007 release to late August of that year. In addition to the lead designer being absent for roughly a fifth of the game's development cycle, the scope of the game became too large and the design had to accommodate for it. And building for the still relatively new at the time PSP hardware. But even so, Vicious Cycle still made one of the most unique and hilarious games I've ever had the privilege of playing. And it would have been nice for more people to have gotten to play it too. The in-house engine used for this game, aptly titled the Vicious Engine, was made intentionally easy to cross-platform games, should publishers decide to go that route. For example, this game. I can only imagine it would have at least controlled better had it gotten ported to consoles. But alas, that never came to be, and Deadhead Fred would permanently stay a PSP exclusive. It's definitely a standout title on the little handheld that could. I just wish it would have gotten a little bit more attention from audiences than it did. And I don't want to give too much away in regards to the game's ending, but if it had done well enough, I would have loved to see what a sequel could have brought. Hell, even John C. McGinley stated he would love to reprise his role in a potential sequel, and with that kind of endorsement, it'd be hard not to be excited for what he would have brought to the table. But this is Franchise Graveyard, so you know what that means. It's now time to talk about the grim fact that Deadhead Fred, unless the rights get snapped up by another developer, will more than likely never get another game. Despite the rather rocky development, Deadhead Fred actually didn't spell the end for Vicious Cycle. Shortly before Deadhead Fred was released, Vicious Cycle was acquired by the American branch of D3 Publisher, and through them they went on to release both of the Matt Hazard games and the American-made Earth Defense Force spin-off Insect Armageddon, all of which ran on the upgraded Vicious Engine 2. Though the latter game was the one original title developed in a sea of licensed games they released after 2010. And after a few Ben 10 games and a couple of games based on the CGI Pac-Man show I never watched, they would go on to release Adventure Time, Finn and Jake Investigations, and a Smash Brothers clone based on Kung Fu Panda, until they would finally close their doors in January 2016. And with that, we've reached the end of this look at this unique PSP game. Pretty crazy to think that a company that would go on to make almost exclusively family-friendly licensed games also made this dark, violent, and crass game that featured decapitations and F-bombs. And while it would most certainly be a treat to return to that world, especially if the game's lead actor is on board, I think I'm also content with this being a one-and-done sort of deal at the same time. I lean more closely to wanting to see a sequel to this for sure, but at the same time, I can see this being completely self-contained, which it more than likely is going to be since the developer is no more. If the stars do end up aligning in such a way that we do see a sequel, and with John C. McGinley back in the starring role, then it'll be a day one purchase for me. But until such a day arrives, if it even does, Deadhead Fred will remain buried in the franchise graveyard. Hey there, thanks for checking out the video. If you liked it, do me a solid and share it around on your Twitters and your Facebooks and your OnlyFans and all your other social media platforms. Here's a couple more videos of mine you can check out, and if you happen to like what you see, do consider subscribing. Oh, and wash your hands.